John, thank you for your gracious introduction today. I want to begin by talking about the conventional wisdom. As that from Hollywood to the halls of academia, we often hear the message that marriage doesn't matter. Kids and families, we're told, need not enjoy the shelter and the security of a married home to thrive. Take, for instance, Jennifer Aniston, who said, quote, that women are realizing it more and more, knowing that they don't have to settle with a man just to have that child. Or in her book on Maverick Moms, which celebrates women who have had boys without fathers, the Cornell psychologist Peggy Drexler claimed that, quote, women possess the innate mom power that in itself is more than sufficient to raise fine sons. And then this Pollyannish message is also taken up by some in the media. This spring, for instance, Matthew Iglesias at Vox gave explicit voice to the idea that the decline of marriage isn't a problem for women, children, and the country as a whole. Of course, the only problem with this new conventional wisdom about marriage and family life is that it's not true. That's the only problem. And this morning, I'm going to give you some of the highlights of some new research that I have done with the economists Joseph Price and Robert Lerman. And this research underlines the connection between marriage and the economic health of the American states. It's this report here that's up on the screens to your left and to your right here. So let's begin with this conversation this morning by considering how it is that marriage matters in this country of ours. And I think you've probably heard over the last day or two this story that just came out actually this month from Princeton and Brookings about sort of how marriage is connected to the welfare, to the well-being of our kids. And what we can see here in this new publication from Princeton and Brookings is that, quote, reams of social science and medical research convincingly show that children who are raised by their married biological parents enjoy better physical, cognitive, and emotional outcomes, on average, than children who are raised in other circumstances. Okay, so clearly the social sciences are telling us that our kids are more likely to flourish when they're raised in intact married homes. And now I say this to you as someone who's been raised by a single mother, and many kids, like me and my sister, turned out just fine. But I'm also speaking to you this morning as a social scientist, and what I'm saying to you also this morning is that on average, our kids are more likely to flourish, as this new publication from Princeton and Brookings tells us, when they have the benefit of an intact married parent family behind them. But I want to turn our thinking away from just the kids and sort of think about how this is sort of playing out for the larger society, and to think in particular about how what's happening to our marriages in our society, in our states more particularly, is linked to what's happening in our economies at the state level. As we were exploring this issue, we found that virtually no research had been published on the connection between the health of marriage and economic growth. And this is ironic, of course, because the term economics is rooted in the Greek term oikonomia, forgive my Greek, which means, quote, the management of the household. Okay? And so for that reason that Joseph Price, Robert Lerman, and I set out in our report, Strong Families, Prosperous States, to study the link between marriage and economics at the state level. In other words, what was the connection between the health of a state's marriage culture and its economy? And what we have found in this new report is that when families are stronger in a state, when there are more married parent families in a state, you see higher levels of economic growth, you see less child poverty, you see higher levels of median family income, and you see that the American dream is more likely to be realized by poor kids growing up in states where the family is strong. So if you look, for instance, at this slide here on child poverty, I have to look at probably pretty carefully here. What you see is that states like New Mexico, Louisiana, and South Carolina have some of the highest levels of child poverty in this country, in part because these states have comparatively few married parents in them. And it's partly because of that their families are less likely to be able to deliver economic resources to the kids in their states. By contrast, states like New Hampshire, Minnesota, North Dakota have comparatively low levels of child poverty, in part because so many of their families in those states are headed by married parents. And of course, they can bring more economic resources to the table, in part because they are married. So again, there's a connection here at the state level between child poverty and the health of the married parent family. We also see a very similar story when it comes to the American dream, looking here at the odds that a child growing up in a poor family at the 25th percentile moves up to a higher percentile, kind of lives the American dream as an adult. What we see is that states like New Mexico, Louisiana, and South Carolina, again, are not doing so well. That kids from these kinds of states are less likely to move towards the middle class, towards the 50th percentile as adults. By contrast, kids growing up in a state like Utah, for instance, which has the highest share of married parenthood in the nation, are more likely to move towards that 50th percentile as adults because they've benefited from growing up in a community, in a neighborhood, in an area where there are lots of married parent families in the mix. So again, there's a connection here between the health of the American dream for poor kids and the health of the married parent family in our states. And if we kind of think about this in a broader sense, think about kind of what would the economic profile of our states look like? You know, if our states enjoyed, on average, kind of 1980 levels of married parenthood, we see a pretty different economic picture for our states in the U.S. on average. We'd see basically a state per capita GDP that'd be about 4% higher. We would see child poverty rates about 17% lower. And we'd see family median income resting at a rate of 10% higher. That's 10% higher. So there's clearly, again, a connection between what's happening in our families and what's happening in our state economies. And you know, in our culture today, there's been a lot of discussion in policy circles, in media circles, in academic circles about the impact of education and race on the economic arena. And these are very important factors, don't get me wrong. But what's striking about our newest report is that we find that at least at the state level, when it comes to outcomes like economic mobility, child poverty, and median family income, that family structure is a better predictor of these outcomes than our race or education. So again, family matters here very powerfully when it comes to the health of our state economies. So the bottom line here is that if you care about growth, child poverty, family income, and the American dream, you should care about the health of the family, both in the country at large and in your community and state more particularly. I want to think, though, now about why it is that marriage matters. Why is there such a strong connection between healthy families and healthy state economies? And I want to begin kind of taking a sort of a point that was elucidated by Jason Carroll with this idea that I think men especially are affected by marriage and family life. This is an idea that's not unique, of course, to me. It was articulated back in 1998, for instance, by the Nobel laureate George Akerlof, who was also the husband of our new Fed chair, Janet Yellen. He said, quote, "Men settle down when they get married," unquote. And his basic argument was that the responsibilities attendant to being a married father are likely to motivate men to be more responsible and more directly engaged in the marketplace. And so we see in the research, for instance, that men who are married tend to work more hours than their comparable single peers. They work more strategically. They're less likely, for instance, to be fired than their comparable single peers. And they work more successfully. They make more money than their comparable single peers. We can see this, for instance, at the level of labor force participation. Married men with kids are 13 percentage points more likely to be in the labor force compared to their peers who are single without kids. So again, a very clear connection between marriage, men, and work in our society. We also think, though, that sort of the organization of the household matters. And we know that married families have more money to manage, and they tend to manage it more prudently than their single and cohabiting peers. They draw on economies of scale. They pool income. They have higher rates of saving. They get more financial support from their kin. And they're more likely to kind of go the distance, which also reinforces their economic position. So again, there's a connection here between what's happening in the household and what's happening kind of in the checking account, if you will. And we see a family income premium for African Americans, for Hispanics, for whites, for less educated Americans, for college-educated Americans, that's related to marital status, as these slides up here on your left and right suggest. And then finally, we know that strong families foster the accumulation of human capital. We know that kids who are being raised by intact married families are more likely to graduate from high school, graduate from college. They're more likely to be gainfully employed as young adults and to work more hours. It's true for both young men and young women. So if you're concerned about young women's professional opportunities, you should be concerned about their family structure growing up. And at the state level, what we see in our new report is that states that enjoy higher levels of married parenthood, as these slides to your left and right show you, also have higher rates of high school completion. So again, at both the household level and at the state level, we see a connection between education and strong families. So if we put all this together in terms of the why here, what we're suggesting, we're hypothesizing, is there's a connection between strong families and state prosperity, because marriage and family life deepen men's connections to the labor force, they boost family income and assets, and they improve the accumulation of human capital in today's contemporary world. Now, as I've been talking, you may be thinking about which states have been more affected by this retreat from marriage, and why, or why not? And when progressives are thinking about this question, about sort of why some groups have been affected more by the retreat from marriage, they tend to gravitate towards what's called social structural explanations, usually economic explanations. So for instance, in talking about this sort of issue, Annie Lowry, who was working then for the New York Times, wrote that, quote, "From an economist's perspective, our collective allergy to matrimony might be a macroeconomic issue. So in order to save marriage, we'd have to end poverty. Or in more simple terms, it's the economy, stupid. That's why we've seen such a big retreat from marriage, particularly in the working class and poor, as Dr. Carroll noted just a few moments ago." A different perspective would say, well, actually, it's about more than money, that culture matters, that public policy matters. So Bell Sawhill of Brookings has said that, quote, "A purely economic theory fails short as an explanation of the dramatic transformation of family life in the US in recent decades." And of course, there's evidence here historically that we can use to, I think, back up Dr. Sawhill's observation. We know, for instance, that at the height of the Great Depression in the 1930s, when the economy was in terrible shape, we had much higher levels of family stability, much lower levels of divorce, much lower levels of single parenthood than we do today. So clearly, what's happening in the family is not simply about economics. But what does that sort of say about what's happening today in states across the country? How does this sort of play out at the state level? And what we find in this new report basically is that states primarily in the north, from this state here in Utah, across to New Hampshire, New England, kind of in the area where I grew up, are doing pretty well on the married parenthood front. By contrast, states primarily in the south, states like Georgia and Louisiana, are not doing so well, as this figure here suggests. And that leads us to think about sort of the social, structural, and the cultural explanations for what's happening to marriage and family life in our country today. And so I think there is something to this progressive idea that economics obviously matters, that education matters. So states like Mississippi and Louisiana are doing not so well, for instance, in part I think because they have low levels of education. By contrast, states like Minnesota and New Hampshire are doing comparatively well on the married parent front because they have higher levels of education. So this set of findings is broadly consistent with kind of a more progressive view on family life in America. But if we turn to a different set of states, states like Idaho, just nearby obviously, South Dakota, and here in Utah, we see often middling or even lower levels of education coexisting with high degrees of marriage. And here I think a kind of a cultural explanation about the way in which these states, these communities tend to value marriage is more compelling. And I echo the words of David Leonhardt at the New York Times, who's written about this subject 3 times actually in the upshot, his section in the New York Times. He said, quote, "The respect and even reverence for the idea of marriage found in conservative communities may affect people's behavior and attitudes, unquote, in ways, of course, that reinforce the strength and the stability of married life in more conservative communities and states. So kind of putting all this together, our bottom line, our conclusion is that both structural and cultural factors explain why some states have proved to be more successful in resisting the nationwide retreat from marriage. And you can see these states in blue on the map up here on your left and your right. So given all this, kind of where do we go from here? And I'm wrapping up my remarks today. What's to be done here? One, I think, key point to make here is that given the structural realities that I mentioned, we need to think more about how we can shore up the economic foundations of working class and poor families and communities across the United States. And one area we can do this thing is in the arena of educational policy. We need to recognize that even today, most Americans will not get a college degree. And yet our educational system tends to be focused solely on that as sort of the primary goal in mind. So we need to serve our kids who are not on that track much better with, among other things, I think, better vocational and apprenticeship training, which would improve, I think, their sense of identity, of course, their economic prospects, and I think down the road, their marriage prospects as well. A second point when it comes to public policy is that we need to take, I think, very seriously this classic idea of doing no harm when it comes to marriage and family life. And the unfortunate reality is that too many of our public policies targeting lower-income Americans that are sort of produced and supported with the most noble intentions unintentionally penalize marriage. And that matters because a third of Americans today are receiving some kind of means-tested benefit, from something like Medicaid to food stamps. And so because these policies are penalizing marriage, the research suggests they may also be undercutting the value of marriage in working class and poor communities. So that has got to end. But we also, I think, need to realize that what's happening in our families can be affected in some ways only at the margins of what happens in Washington and Salt Lake City and Sacramento, in our federal and state capitals. Public policy can only kind of reach so far. We need to be thinking about creative cultural and civic strategies to change marriage and family life, to change relationships in our culture. And I think we can take some comfort from the successful campaign that was inaugurated in the early 1990s by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, and working with a range of partners from Hollywood to religious institutions to schools. They've helped to bring down the teen pregnancy rate more than 50% since 1990. So that's kind of an example that we should use as we think about ways to reintegrate or resurrect what Jason called the success sequence, as encouraging young adults to put education, work, marriage, and parenthood in that order alive in our culture. So I'd like to conclude by saying that given the central role that marriage plays in fostering growth, prosperity, and the American dream, the nation needs to renew the economic, the policy, the civic, and the cultural foundations of marriage and family life for the 21st century. Now, clearly there is no magic bullet when it comes to renewing families. Some will doubt the justice and others the feasibility of such a project. But this report demonstrates that some states have achieved a measure of success in resisting the nation's retreat from marriage. If more states could get behind public policies that do not penalize marriage, educational efforts that strengthen the earning power of working class and poor young men, and civic efforts to make the culture more marriage-friendly, we just might see a renaissance in marriage and family life in America. And that would bring about improvement in not only the state of our unions, but also the wealth of our states. Thank you.